The United States of America is the focus point of the world. It's a melting pot of different cultures and ideas and has been for many, many years. It took off after the Second World War and also after the Cold War, where the United States was victorious both times. Since then, the United States has been a front runner in politics, economy, social justice, racial justice, and much more. However, in the last couple of years, something has changed. The United States seems to have dropped the ball when it comes to the progress of social justice. The United States are, for example, known for their human rights activists such as Martin Luther King Jr., Susan B. Anthony, and Rosa Parks, who all have made significant difference for people, not only in the United States but also in the world. Since the 60s, human rights has been one of the most important issues in the United States, and great progress was made. For example, the end of segregation. It seemed like the struggle in the 60s was successful, a significant improvement to the inequality. Though it seemed to have become better, there are now more stories about racism, sexism, and inequality in the news than ever before. With more than 320 million citizens in one country, it is impossible to prevent inequality. But do the average people experience it on a daily basis? And do they see it as a big problem in the United States? And where in history have they seen it before?
During the 2.5 long path through Boston called the Freedom Trail, we interviewed a girl named Lisa, who told us about how she experiences inequality on a daily basis, and that there are inequality everywhere. She actually cites an example from the work environment where inequality between men and women can often occur. She also mentions that there are a lot of white people in the tech industry, and not a lot of me, but that she believes in a slow change with the time.
Hey guys, today we're out in Boston, Massachusetts, and we're going to talk to some people about inequality and if they have experienced anything on their daily basis. If you look back in history, do you see any significant places where you can recognize inequality?
Well, that's a that's a broad question. If I look back in like American history in general, or
just
the history of Boston history, I mean, I was not born and raised here. I've lived here for like the last decade or so. But I know that there were things with like busing. Some time ago, there's things with, I guess the Yawkey, who used to be, I guess, an owner of Red Sox or something like that, and I guess he has a pretty checkered past and things like that. But that's about all I know. I don't have any like direct information about inequality in Boston in the past, I guess.
And how about now on your daily basis? Do you see any inequality?
I mean, what kind of inequality are you talking about? Economic, racial, like? Because I mean, you walk through here and you clearly see like homeless people, disenfranchised people all over the place.
Well, in school, like women and men, like that.
I'm not in school.
No,
Sorry.
I didn't say that.
Just general inequality. Sure. There's inequality everywhere in all kinds of ways. There's inequality in the workplace where, as a woman, maybe your voice isn't heard as much as your male coworkers. Sometimes you say one thing and then your male coworker says the same thing. Everyone's like, "Oh, great idea," and you're like, "I totally just said that, but that's cool." Or like I don't know that I would call it inequality, but there is something I think interesting about the fact that most of the tech spaces, like I work in tech, and most of the tech spaces are there's a big representation of white males and not a lot of me working in tech industries. So you gotta wonder why that is. I guess that's the sort of thing that I sort of see and or experience sometimes.
Okay, and now you say you wonder why that is.
Yeah.
Do you reckon any change that?
Yeah, but I mean, I don't have any answers to it. I mean, I can certainly say that, like, growing up myself, there wasn't a lot of exposure to some of these sort of male-dominated fields or fields that are jobs that are traditionally held by, like, men or white men or any of that stuff. I think probably people growing up today have a lot more exposure to that stuff because, the internet and social media, and there's a lot of outreach from tech companies, big tech companies. They're doing, like, women in science. Will see a change. I just think it's slow going. The entry is a little steep. A lot of people still think you need to go to, like, school to get, a degree in some of these things, and that's always, cost prohibitive, especially if you come from, like, a lower class economic family or something like that. So I think that still is a thing that has to be addressed. It's not enough to just show kids or, minority communities or low income communities that, like, these things are possible if you're not helping to also make them possible through various, things. So I guess that's it.
Okay, that was about it.
Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you. If you look back in history, do you see any significant places where there might be inequality? And if yes, how? Where?
Inequality has existed forever.
Yeah.
Sexual orientation, gender, religious, racial.
If you look at Boston, and that's history, and the history of Boston.
Oh, in the history of Boston?
Yeah. When do you see change or anything significant?
Well, Boston or America is still working on it. I mean, we had the Declaration of Independence, but, that's a hard thing for humans to live up to. I mean, and the United States does its best, but it falls short because we're human. And we came from cultures like Denmark and other cultures that, struggled with. It goes down through the generations. Stuff gets passed down from generation to generation.
Yeah. And if you look on your daily basis, do you see inequality at work or in your shop or anything else?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know if I see inequality. I feel like right now there's a resurgence for equality that happened when I was younger in the late 60s, early 70s. It's coming back, that idea of more, it's an evolving thing. It keeps evolving, is how I see it. When women are speaking up more, African Americans are speaking up more, gay people are speaking up more.
And do you think they are heard?
I think they resonate. I don't know what it'll do, but it resonates with people. If their people have a conscience or if they're, if they can relate it to their own experiences. But there's pushback, obviously.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that was it.
That's it?
Yeah.
All right.
Thanks,
Well, you guys have very good English.
The second interview we got in Boston were with a guy named David, who acknowledged that there are and were inequalities in American society, and that there is not only gender inequality, but inequality among many things, such as religion, race, and sexual orientation, and so on. He also says that not only Boston, but whole America is working on reducing the inequality among people. To get rid of inequality, we have to evolve as humans, and there are many signs of a falling inequality. Women, African Americans, and gays are speaking up more.
It was hard getting interviews in Washington, near impossible. We asked about 25 people and got rejected about 25 times. They were worried that if they were filmed answering questions about inequality, it could lead to them losing their job if it went viral or the wrong people saw it. However, some did agree to answer the questions as long as we didn't record them. We asked them the questions: do you experience inequality on a daily basis and how? And where in history can we see inequality? We made sure that the questions were broad so that the interviewee could interpret the answer to the kind of inequality that affects them. The first person we asked was an older man who answered that he had experienced inequality, however not on a daily basis. He had been called different racial slurs when he had been on the subway, not today, that was just through his life, but it wasn't a lot and he didn't really experience any sort of inequality at his work. Though he was a little more scared of the police than he felt like people should be. He had a lot of trust in the system, as he said. To the second question, he answered that it is easy to find places of inequality and racism in history, but he didn't really think that looking back would help the country moving forward. The second person who would answer our questions also agreed to do it as long as we didn't record the answers. This time we asked a woman and we made sure to ask the same questions. She said that she didn't experience inequality on a daily basis, but almost every day. She felt that no matter how well she would do her job, her boss wouldn't give her the same recognition as her male co-workers. She said that no matter how much time she spent at her job and how well she did her job, it would always be her male co-workers who would get the praise. To the second question, she said that there are many places in history where men have oppressed women, and the historic place of inequality that she focused on was the fact that women weren't allowed to vote until 1920, almost 150 years after the United States became a nation.
New York was the last place we had to go on a field trip. This also included us needing some interviews. We were only for New York for a few days and had no time to interview anyone since they were so hard to interview in the big city. We asked around all over New York the first day. We got declined person by person, and none wanted to help us with the interview. After a few hours trying to find someone, there was a lady that were willing to help us, but she couldn't accept being filmed, so we asked her 2 questions about inequality. And since it's a very broad question, we told her to point out something that she maybe had experienced in her daily life or just in general. It happens to be that she had a terrible story, but also a good story that we could use. She worked at a company where they had to make discussion on which item to use or some other stuff. But every time there were 10 people who sat down at a table and didn't left until they figured out what to use. So every time they sat down and started talking, she couldn't say anything. She didn't have a voice at the company, so she couldn't bring any ideas to the table and weren't allowed to say anything. This was only because she was a black woman. After she replied on the question I followed up with, what could you do to prevent inequality in your daily life? She continued and talking about all the things that had happened in the history, which actually led to my next question. Where in the history do we see inequality? And she said that most of the stuff that would help to prevent inequality already were tried, and that it has helped, and only with time now it will change. The second person we asked was a man who didn't feel or see any equality in his daily life, even though he did mention his work and how the women were treated there. He said all kinds of stuff about the women not getting a say. The second person we asked was a man who didn't feel or see any inequality in his daily life, even though he did mention his work and how the women were treated there. He said all kinds of stuff about the women not getting as said, and that they didn't get as much paid as the men that worked there. And sometimes when a woman came with an idea, it was the man who got all the credit. From our field trip in the USA on 14 days, we've been several places. We started in Boston, then we went to DC, and at last, New York. The assignment was that we had to interview 2 people each place, and we had the following questions. Do you experience inequality on a daily basis? And can you point out some history of inequality? This was so we could get an opinion from some of the different cultures in the US.
After a discussion and interviews with the Americans, we came to the conclusion that there is still a lot of inequality in the US, but that people experience it in very different ways, depending on who they are and where they live. And since we talked to 6 different people, we got a few different answers, especially for the question about the history of inequality. We knew that everyone had an opinion about the topic, mostly because it's such a broad topic, and most people knew about the history and what happened. Everyone agrees that the country has moved forward since the major civil rights campaigns in the 60s, and that there is still some way to go. But they disagree whether or not the past should influence the future.